Hey InfoViz, me here. I wanted to congratulate you all on making it to the very last lecture. In this one, we're going to be talking a little bit about the future of AI. You should never trust the predictions of any academic about what's going to happen more than about 15 minutes into the future. But let's see how I do. We're going to cover two questions today. Firstly, is AI going to take over the world? And secondly, is AI going to take your job? You've probably heard a lot about the potential future threats of AI and how it might actually do what it always seems to do in the Hollywood movies. This has been lent credibility by some very credible people, Bill Gates, Elon Musk. I don't know, is he still credible? Well, he's wealthy and we sometimes confuse the two as a society. But there's lots of people, eminent philosophers, psychologists, computer scientists, business people, who have all said that AI poses a substantial risk and that we should seriously think before developing and deploying these technologies. So we should ask the question, is AI actually going to pose a risk, and do we have to think carefully? No, we don't really. Compared to all of the actual serious threats we have today, worrying about whether it's going to take over the planet Skynet style is not really at the top of the list. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in class. No, I probably should cover that in a bit more detail then. All right, here we go. Humanity's last invention. This is Jürgen Schmidhuber, Professor Jürgen Schmidhuber. He is one of the leading AI researchers currently practicing. He's one of the founders of deep learning, one of the originators of many of the techniques used in modern neural networks, a true visionary, kind of mad, like relatively megalomaniacal, but that does happen sometimes. And this is Jürgen Schmidhuber's website. Let's just bask in it for a second. Some real 1997 vibes there, but man can't be a genius at everything. This shows a whole bunch of different areas that he's contributed to in terms of neural networks that operate on time, artificial evolution, and how you can use genetic methods to make neural networks smarter, robots, some measures of interestingness, and how AI can be used to measure art progress. But if you look just at the top sentence, it says this: since 15 or so, Jürgen Schmidhuber has been trying to build a self-improving AI that is smarter than himself, and then retire. It's a nice line. He opens up a lot of his speeches with it. It basically boils down to, I want to make a computer that's smarter than me, and then, having fulfilled my purpose, I'm done. Is that possible? If we make something smarter than ourselves, which would then be able to make something smarter than itself, which would then be able to make something smarter than itself, and so on and so on, are we done? This isn't Schmidhuber's idea. It, of course, as with many of these things, drawing on a century or more of research in this area. The British mathematician I.J. Good, who worked with Turing during World War II, said, let an ultra-intelligent machine be defined as one that can far surpass the intellectual activities of any human, however clever. I'm just going to remove some of the gender from this. It was from 1965. Since the design of machines is one of those intellectual activities, an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There would then unquestionably be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of humans would be left far behind. Thus, the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that any human need ever make. It's a compelling idea, right? This idea that if we can just get AI to be a little bit better than ourselves, then we will have both proven that it is possible for an intelligence to make a smarter intelligence, and in doing so, be able to hand over the torch. If you extend this question, this idea, will AI be humanity's last invention? Because if it's smarter than us, then make something smarter than that, smarter than that, smarter than that. Why don't we let it make everything? Design cars, design planes, design health systems, design drugs, design chairs. And we can take a long-deserved rest in some kind of post-scarcity techno-utopia. This idea has been probably most popularized by futurist Ray Kurzweil, who says this singularity, this technological singularity is coming. He's actually made a lot of predictions across his lifetime, and many of them have turned out to be true. The idea that we would stop using desktop computers and move to mobile devices no thicker than a pad of paper and so on has proven to be at least partially accurate, as have many of Kurzweil's other predictions. So should we take him seriously? What exactly does he mean by a singularity? He talks about this idea that the future is accelerating. That is, human progress is accelerating. And if you look all the way back, you see on the bottom of this chart, look about time before the present in terms of 10 to the 10 years, 10 to the 9, 10 to the 6, and so on. And then in the vertical axis, we have the time to the next thing. Right? So in other words, the gaps between these, because these are both log scales, right? The gaps between life and then the first multicellular organism, and then first mammals, and then the first human ancestors, and then so on, cities, agriculture, city-states, printing, the Industrial Revolution, so on. The time between them seems to be getting exponentially shorter, or in other words, progress is accelerating rapidly. Now, it might not look on this log plot that progress appears to be accelerating. Remember, the nature of log plots is that everything is 10 times, or some exponential factor 10 times as large as the next thing down. If you were to plot this on a linear plot, it would look like this, which I think you can see has a great deal of acceleration to it. Even if you were to cut everything before the emergence of human ancestors, it would still look like an accelerating logarithmic plot, as in the time between the invention of agriculture and the invention of the printing press was much, much longer than the time between the invention of the printing press and the computer. So there's some argument, right, that things continue to accelerate. We've seen this in computing technology as well. You're probably familiar with Moore's law. If you follow Moore's law over a century, from the first analytical engines of Babbage and Lovelace through the first manual calculators, the tabulators as they were called in sort of World War I and the interwar period, through to the first computers and Turing's work in general computing machines around and after World War II, and then through the development of computers as we recognize, first powered by vacuum tubes, then transistors, and then silicon chips. There appears to be, and again this is a log scale, an exponential increase in computing power. Here's another one. The previous chart was in terms of the amount of computing power that you can purchase per dollar. And if you then instead look at the total largest possible amount of computing power, you see the same kind of plot. The transistor count, just the total number of switches involved in making logical decisions on one of these chips, is increasing exponentially. And every now and then people say, oh, Moore's law is over, and then it turns out if you just reinterpret it, it seems to continue. This argument that this exponential growth in computing power will lead to an exponential growth in AI power or intelligence, how valid is that? So what they're saying effectively is that machines smarter than us will be able to make machines smarter than them. The singularity is the point at which that process, a new machine being developed and then that machine making a smarter machine, appears to be instantaneous. In other words, if we're making new and smarter machines faster and faster, then eventually it will seem to us as if a new generation of machine comes out instantaneously, and there will be an explosion, an acceleration, at which point machines will reach some limit, will surpass some limit. All predictions of the future, in fact, all predictions in general, fail to really understand what happens after an exponential curve takes off, right? It's just impossible to really predict what might happen. Some people seem to suggest that this curve will continue to some infinity and produce some kind of machine god. Others suggest that it'll just produce a whole pile of economic benefits. This tends to produce ideas like, well, how do we make sure that such a future superintelligence will be our friends? That may sound silly, but let's imagine an example. Imagine you have a machine, an intelligent machine, that is solely designed to produce paperclips. You own a paperclip company and you say, look, I could try and think about better ways to produce more and more paperclips, but how about I get one of these new AIs to do it for me? Okay, Clippy, make me as many paperclips as you can. Clippy first invents new paperclip making machines and makes the factories more and more efficient, and then realizes that it can leverage the stock market to buy more and more factories. And then suddenly Clippy is leveraging the news media to bias people towards buying more paperclips. And then suddenly Clippy controls governments to make sure that more and more people are buying more and more paperclips. And every time Clippy seems to come up against a wall and people seem to be buying no more paperclips, Clippy breaks out, gets smarter, gets faster, and finds a new lever by which to control the world. And the end result of that, of course, is there is nothing left on Earth except a pile of paperclips, about 10 feet deep, covering the entirety of the Earth's surface and making it highly reflective from space, which might actually help with global warming. That's another story. It sounds absurd, right? But this kind of paperclip maximizer is a real problem. How would you build a paperclip maximizing artificial intelligence such that it didn't hurt people? What does it mean to be friendly? There are a lot of philosopher, mathematician, computer scientist types actually seriously asking that question. It tends to come down to things like, well, how do you measure in a computer what is good? What will make the most number of people as happy as possible? Can you put a number on happiness? You tend to run into questions like, if you could make every other single person on the planet measurably happier, 7 billion people happier, would it make sense to kill me? If by my death, which would create a measurable negative amount of good, but you could create a greater positive amount of good elsewhere? These are obviously questions we don't have to deal with in our legal system because we have hard lines about what is and isn't allowed. But in a computer, everything has simply a cost. And what cost murder? You might be thinking, hey, I've seen this movie. This is literally a movie. You've strayed into the realms of science fiction. And I have. This is absurd, right? At some point during this lecture, we left the bounds of computer science behind us, and we strayed into this realm of the absurd, this realm of Asimov's laws of robotics. These are things that science fiction has been helping us grapple with. These are ideas that we have been exploring in fiction for more than 100 years. And yet suddenly the world seems to be in the grip of this as a serious problem. What happened? Why are folks like Bill Gates, an apparently incredibly respectable person who has done a huge amount of good for the planet in terms of vaccines, health systems, water systems, etc., kind of makes up for being the person responsible for Clippy. How did we get here? How did we get to the point where such eminent folks are really considering this? I don't know. I can't comment on that. Maybe some part of it is that in doing so, they raise a great deal of attention towards AI and thereby increase the pool of research funding available. But I have a couple of criticisms of these ideas. I'm just one researcher in the field, but these are drawn from my experiences and my discussions with many people. I have a couple of ideas that you can use to maybe dissuade people from these arguments should the discussion come up when you mention that you've been working on designing with AI. The first criticism is we all seem to be supporting this idea with Moore's law, with the idea that computers get faster. Is that the problem? Is the hardware the limit on intelligence? Or to look at this another way, is calculation speed the same thing as intelligence? Well, what is intelligence? Is there more to it than speed? I don't know that we can assume that there is nothing more to building a smart machine than to be able to think fast enough, though. I think that is assuming away a lot of complexity that we've yet to understand. And maybe we will. You should never assume that the future will always look like the present. But you also shouldn't assume that there are no barriers, no friction on the takeoff of some exponential trend. Second criticism is intelligence, general intelligence, that is, some factor that makes you better and smarter at doing everything, is general intelligence a thing? Like, does that exist? Now, this has been a question for people who do research in like IQ tests for hundreds of years. And let's put aside the kind of racist, eugenics-focused early history of intelligence testing and its attempt to prop up the idea that the white race is superior. Literally, there's a bunch of stuff like that in the history of intelligence testing. I'm going to just not talk about that today. But there is something measurable. IQ tests are well validated. You can measure the capacity of someone to solve very general problems better. But if we can measure the existence of some general factor of intelligence in humans, it still doesn't imply that that scale goes on forever. And that if we can make a machine that is a bit smarter than us, it will be able to make a machine smarter than it. That's quite an assumption, right? It rests on this idea that there is this general quantity of intelligence that you can just make more of. That you can just, like trying to pump money into a system, just go and get more of it. And that it will follow an exponential growth curve, no less. You can really see the kind of Silicon Valley venture capital style backings of this sort of thought, right? There is always this idea that exponential growth is possible and that there's always more money following the current money, and that that idea has just been ported straight over to intelligence. Oh, there's always more intelligence possible and you can always just go and get it. And it's not clear that those assumptions are well founded. There's a bit more of a subtle criticism, I think. This idea of self-improvement requires thinking about thinking, and then thinking about that thinking about thinking. We call this meta-reasoning. So reasoning is thinking about the world. I am hungry. I am going to make an omelet. Meta-reasoning is thinking about thinking. Why did I want an omelet? Wait, why am I worried about what food I want? These are all different increasing levels of meta-reasoning, reasoning about your reasoning about your reasoning. And we, as adult humans, have the capacity to meta-reason as much as we need. We can think about any of our thoughts, even if that thought was also thinking about some of our other thoughts. And while it is fairly useless to do so, we could do so arbitrarily. We can keep getting deeper. Can machines? Is infinite meta-reasoning, like always being able to think about yourself, possible? What's the difference between meta-reasoning and consciousness? Well, that's a debate I'm not going to get into. But if you propose that a machine can improve itself, or at least produce another machine that is a derivative of itself but smarter, then you would need to have that kind of self-reflective capacity in near infinite amounts. And it's not clear to me that those who advocate for a singularity, for an intelligence explosion, have provided sufficient evidence that that is actually the case. So you add that all up, and I don't think we necessarily have to worry that Skynet is going to be a thing, or that by putting research into self-driving cars, we are obsoleting ourselves as a species. And that Ray Kurzweil's predictions that in 100 years' time, natural life will be a minority and synthetic life will be the norm. I mean, it's possible. I'm not going to tell you it's not possible, but I don't think that the evidence is there to support that it is likely. This is probably the most important point, though. Talking about intelligence super explosions, talking about the hard takeoff on the exponential curve as the threat, and ignoring the damage that AI poorly applied might do now, ignoring the damage of predictive policing, ignoring the damage of state-level surveillance programs, ignoring the damage of systems in a university designed to identify students at risk being used incorrectly. It's really a problem about how people are using the limited existing capability, much more than a problem of what is going to happen at some date in the future when the machines take off. And whenever someone talks about the singularity, I wonder if they're perhaps unconsciously deflecting attention away from any ethical criticisms of their current investment and then their current practices and their current development. Because if there's a huge risk around the corner, well, maybe we don't have to worry about the medium-sized risk that's here today. I wouldn't ever accuse any specific person of deliberately doing that, of course. But as a society, we do seem to latch onto the dramatic, very low probability problem rather than the hard to fix and kind of depressing but 100% right here, right now problem. Bit of a human frailty. In summary, though, when a famous thinker, when a famous thought leader or business person, entrepreneur, researcher says that something is going to change, you should probably believe them. They probably know what they're talking about. When they say that there is going to be a big change, that it's coming around the corner, that something is going to have to break in the current system, they're almost certainly right, especially if they're old, right? Especially if they've been doing this for a very long time. But when they say how things are going to change, regardless of how famous they are, regardless of how much that you trust, respect, admire, and live in a world shaped by their past accomplishments, when a famous thinker tells you how something is going to change, be a little skeptical. Because huge paradigm shifts are very, very hard to predict. And it doesn't matter how many billions of dollars you have, you're probably going to get it wrong. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about that idea of meta-reasoning and creativity and what that might mean for a machine trying to take your job as a creative designer. And in that one, I think we can get actually well outside of the idea of science fiction and focus entirely on actual research, because artificial creativity happens to be something that Liam and I are researchers in and can speak to on a level that doesn't require referencing Isaac Asimov. So I'll see you in the next video.